Diana Bristol, government appointee. We from North Bay, we have Kevin Cloutier, the optician, elected member. Then we have Omar Farouk, government appointee. We have Elsa Lee, she's the optician, elected member. We have Peggy Judge, government appointees here today. Samir Modhara, he's optician, elected member. And joining us brand new today on the board is Alicia Munyon, government appointee. Welcome aboard. We have Dorina Rates, optician, elected member. Tanya Namayaban. I'm sorry, Tanya, I screwed that one up.
It's a hard one.
Okay. Elected member. We have Rob Zena, optician, elected member. Henry Wierzema, government appointee. And for administration, we have Fazelle Khan, our registrar and CEO, is with us. Amy Stein, deputy registrar and general counsel. And on the computer side of things, monitoring things, helping us out, Carolyn Robertson, manager of communications and executive office. I would now like to do the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this meeting is taking place on the traditional lands of the Anishbeg people. The Anishbeg include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederation. We are dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture and committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect with all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. I come from Irish ancestry, and my parents were born here, and they were Irish and English. I will endeavor to carry myself with gratitude and humility as I work, learn, and live in this area. So welcome, everyone. I just wanted to let the registrants that are joining us on YouTube today that the session can be used as self-directed hours. And I'm now going to turn things over to Fazelle to see if anyone has any other questions before we move on.
Okay. It should be hopefully relatively a short meeting. It's a one-item agenda. So thank you everybody for getting together. This is not a regularly scheduled meeting, but in response to a deadline that we're trying to meet, a government deadline set to approve the emergency class. We're amongst our 26 other regulated health professions that are working on the same thing and trying to meet the same deadline for August. So we appreciate everybody making the time on this Monday morning to work on this agenda item. It has gone for circulation and come back. And we'll just kind of work through it to see what the board's thoughts are and see if we can get this approved today.
Thank you, Fazelle. Does anyone have any conflict of interest to declare? Not seeing any. Okay, we'll move on. And would someone like to make a motion to approve the agenda?
I'll make a motion, Stephen.
Derek, second. Okay, I'll second the motion to move the agenda. And all in favor? That carries. Now let's move on to the emergency class of registration. And I'm going to now turn it over to Rob.
You're on mute, Rob.
I was doing so well. Everybody okay with what I said? So in April 22nd this year, April 2022, the Ontario government enacted Bill 106, the Pandemic and Emergency Preparedness Act, which amended the RHPA to add requirements to the Health Professions Procedural Code. In December, the Ministry of Health enacted the Registration Requirement Regulation that gave effect to these new amendments. And the registration requirements regulations require that healthcare colleges regulations establishing an emergency class of registration. So basically, if there's an emergency, we have to have an emergency class for members to get back into the system. So it'll provide a temporary but expedited path to registration for opticians in the event of a public health emergency, and set up the special requirements that colleges must adhere to when establishing this emergency class. They gave us a broad view of what they wanted, and they gave us a fairly limited choice of what we could do. Basically, it's got to be fair, it's got to be quick, it's got to be easy, and it's got to be cause the class to be open for issuance, and it should specify that the that they're good for no more than 1 year. And they give a few other little requirements, which the registration committee looked at. Let's be fair here, the staff spent a lot of time and effort and came up with a brilliant proposal. Registration committee looked at it, and we decided to send it out to stakeholders for feedback. Okay, so we sent it out for stakeholder feedback. We looked at, we called it the emergency class. A few other minor changes. And we sent it up for stakeholder feedback, and we got our stakeholder feedback. It is attached here. So when we look at the feedback, majority of it was in favor. There was some unknowns and some people that weren't happy of it. Majority of them didn't understand that this is something that we were mandated to. We have no choice of doing it. We have to do it. So aside from that, most of it was fairly well received. I'm trying to roll the screen here, and I can't, of course, because it's not my screen.
Do we want to look perhaps at the briefing note, Rob, that had the summary with the percentages of in favor, opposed, and neutral? Yeah, if we scroll down, yeah, it's on the screen.
Okay, so 58% were in favor of it, 24% were opposed, but the ones that were opposed didn't think that any emergency would require it. There's no need for it. It's a waste of time, and I don't think we'll need more opticians. So if you look at the comments, majority of them were overall people were in favor of it, and it appeared to me that most of the ones that were opposed didn't understand or didn't realize that the government is not giving us an option on this. We have to have this class. Amy, would you like to go over anything that I've kind of missed?
Sure. You know, you've all had a chance to look at the briefing note. So just to go over a little bit of the mechanics. So the main thing that was within this college's sort of purview to flesh out was who's going to be eligible to be part of this class and how does the class get opened. That's what the government wanted and charged each college with coming up with. They want to make sure that this is being done in to meet the individual needs of the profession. So different professions are probably approaching this quite differently. In the case for opticians, what the registration committee was looking at was making this class available to people who are essentially sitting out of practice as inactive. It's been more than 3 years, so they don't have that easy way of getting back into active practice without demonstrating, you know, that they've completed some refresher and bridging modules. 3 to 6 years, they would ordinarily have to go through that process, and it takes a little bit of time to get people back into the field. So this emergency class would take the people in that window of 3 to 6 years and say, okay, if you can demonstrate you've practiced in the last 6 years, let's get you back in and practicing now for this to cover us and carry us through this emergency. So in looking at this, I think the main factor a registration committee wanted to look at was how do we strike that balance? We know that we want opticians to be current, we want them to be up on the latest, but we also know that in an emergency, you have to do what you can to serve the needs of the public. So this was the balance that they found to be most appropriate in the circumstances. Now, some other people that might be included in emergency classes for other professions might be people like students, even those who haven't quite completed their education. And in most cases, they're going to be requiring that these individuals practice under supervision. Well, registration committee also wanted to talk about that, and they noticed that our students already can work under the supervision of a practicing optician, so it wasn't going to increase public access by including students or interns in the class. So in fact, the people who are more likely to be able to help and step up to the plate during those circumstances are those folks in the 3 to 6 year window who ordinarily would have to jump through a few hurdles to get back onto the floor. So that was the rationale for who should be in this class. Now, in terms of how the class will be opened, it's really difficult to predict what the future will look like. I don't think 4 years ago, if anyone had said, oh, by the way, if there's going to be a worldwide pandemic, what is the college going to do? I think a lot of us would have just, kind of laughed a little bit. So we don't really know what the future holds. So the way that the class will be opened has been left very broad in what's proposed in front of you. Essentially, it will be up to the board to decide that there are emergency circumstances that make it such that it's in the public interest to issue certificates in this class. So in other words, you'll have discretion at the time to look at the big picture, look at the full picture and say, okay, there's a problem here where patients aren't able to access opticianry services. It's time to open this class. And it also leaves it open for if the Minister of Health or the Government of Ontario makes a special request to the college that this class be opened, the board can open the class. So those are the sort of main points of the logistics. I would also just want to highlight a couple of the other considerations. As you well know, anytime you look at a decision like this, you want to make sure that you've considered the public interest considerations. So some of the considerations that are noted in your briefing note include that this is meant to facilitate access to opticianry services in the event of a public emergency, and that the aim is to create that balance that we talked about before, where you've got people who are going to have knowledge and skill, maybe not the ideal set of knowledge and skill given the length of time they've been out of practice, but enough that the college can be relatively confident that they will be able to balance the need for emergency services against the need for public safety. And one last point will be on the diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations, which we want to make sure are considered with a decision like this. And that's, again, about striking that balance, facilitating access to services and ensuring opticians will practice safely. Access to services is certainly a DEI issue, accessibility, making sure that everyone has that access to this specialized care. And apart from that, the registration committee itself did not identify any other concerns from a diversity, equity, or inclusion perspective. So, unless there's anything else that Rob, you'd like to add, perhaps we can turn it back over to Steve for some discussion on all of these points.
Well, I think you did pretty good, Amy. Stephen?
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Amy.
Derek, I apologize. Derek, did you have a question?
You're on mute, Derek.
Hang on. I forgot. I did, but it could be part of Stephen's discussion if you prefer. I mean, I do have questions.
Okay, well,
Sorry,
let's just jump right into the questions and discussion part right now. So go ahead, Derek. You've got the floor.
I have two questions towards Rob for this one. Well, actually, two questions, and then one has a follow-up. Question one is 6 years. Was that a arbitrary, let's go 6 years, or were there criteria in picking that number?
There was a little bit of criteria, but staff is one that selected that number. But basically, the longer it is, the more our skills, knowledge, and judgment tend to diminish. So 6 years was considered the an optimum date to get a percent of us up and running quickly. Amy, maybe you'd like to comment on how that was come up with?
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of empirical data on there that we were able to specifically draw on, but it's based on environmental scanning that, this college has done over the years when looking at things like currency, like the, diminishing of skill over time. And, it was about striking a balance. 3 years has typically been this college's benchmark for saying if you're within that 3-year window, there isn't going to be a major need to redevelop your skills. So they took that, and then the extension of that was, okay, so what about this next 3-year period? Is that the sort of next step that we can take in the circumstance, given that we're talking about an emergency here.
So my follow-up question, I'll aim it not to you, Robert, at disrespect, but I'll aim it to Amy just because I think she's gonna have the numbers. What number of opticians do we lose either to retirement or just not renewing on a yearly basis?
Oh, good question. So I actually do have some numbers for you, if you'll just bear with me for one
course.
second.
An average, obviously.
Yeah, and we do have Anna on the line. If she's able to access that that average more quickly than I can, please feel free to jump in. I am just pulling it up in front of me, if you'll just bear with me. I think it's between, I think it's typically around 100 to 150.
So roughly 10% is my.
So we're comfortable. I'm gonna go with the 150 on the high side. Anna, is that okay? Just give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, so we had a bit of a higher number in the past 2 years. Prior to COVID, on average, we had 100 registrants not renewing. For the past couple of years, it was around 160 to 170.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so now I see in 2021, 113, 2022 was 165, 2023 was 178.
So based on averages, and I'm just doing rough math in my head, we feel that in the event of an emergency, an extra 1,000 opticians would be a benefit, assuming everybody re-registered. So that's roughly about 33%. Sounds like a reasonable number, actually, compared to what our actual numbers are of registered. Okay, I just wanted to know the number.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Tanya, and then Samir.
Just a quick question for clarity, and it might be a better question for Amy than you, Rob. Are they using like the pronouns he, she, his, her, just because it mirrors other policy throughout the college?
That's a great question, Tanya. We had specifically requested to change to that gender neutral language in the process of amending our registration regulation, because as hopefully you know, these emergency class amendments are being proposed on top of existing amendments to this regulation. Unfortunately, the Government of Ontario has conventions for all legislation and regulations in the province, and that convention includes using the he and she language. So we made that request, but it's not an option at this point. I can see there perhaps being down the line a move to change that uniformly throughout legislation, but we had to stick with that convention.
Okay, thank you.
Samir.
Thank you very much. And Tanya, great question. Actually, I was thinking about the same question there, but anyway, a couple more questions lined up. First of all, it's going into the quality assurance program. As I'm reading it, I just want to make it more clear myself. We do have the quality assurance requirement for someone returning as an emergency class optician. That's the first question. And second question I have it is regarding emergency class opticians returning to work. Are they eligible to mentor?
Sorry, Samir, can you just repeat the first question?
It's regarding the quality assurance. It's basically when they say 6 years, someone is coming in between window of 3 to 6 years. Are there any requirements regarding quality assurance program? Like, do they require to complete some sort of an, prove that they have some training and done in the past and so on?
So right now, the actual criteria for what will count as that sufficient practice experience to get you back in that 3 to 6 year window, that's going to be dealt with in policy, and those policies will still need to be developed in the future. What we're likely going to be seeing is something similar to the policies that are coming before the board at the next meeting around returning to practice following a period of inactivity. There's certain activities that will sort of count toward that practice experience. And the registration committee is going to need to discuss and look at what's that threshold for the emergency class and how might that threshold be different from the requirements to come back after 3 years in other circumstances. So that's still going to be looked at. A whole other number of pieces will need to be looked at. The fees that emergency class members will pay, what their quality assurance requirements will be, all of that will be dealt with in policy. Putting that in the regulation will make it very difficult to change and adapt if we need to later. So it's in the college's interest, in my opinion, that this be dealt with in policy rather than regulation.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you very much.
We have tried to put as much as possible into policy with our new regs. Hopefully, maybe perhaps coming out this year, we'll be able to deal with them in a more efficient manner.
Thanks, Rob. Omar, and then Derek.
Yeah. In light of an emergency, when the expedition will take place to reinstate the opticians, would the public have any knowledge of who will be the reinstated opticians? Would they be aware of it?
We had this discussion at our meeting, Omar. I think we said no.
Actually, they will be required to identify themselves to the public as emergency or registered optician emergency class.
I
So
apologize.
yeah, that will be actually clear on the public register as well.
Thanks. Derek?
Did I read that the emergency class designation is to last 1 year, or is that correct, or was it longer?
So that's correct. The ministry has stipulated that the registration in this class can be for no more than 1 year at a time, but you can renew it so long as the emergency exists. Now,
I
what
wanted to make sure the
colleges
renewing
will-
option was there.
Yeah, so what the college has proposed in this regulation is that regardless of when you register in the class, you'll need to renew in the normal course at the same time as the renewal for everyone else at the college. This is actually a technological need for our college to not have certificates come up for renewal throughout the year. Our system is not designed to process that. So you will, though, be able to renew in the normal course until such time as the board decides that the emergency itself is over. And there's also, pardon me, if I may add, the process for then transferring your registration to the registered optician class is also set out in the regulation.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, Derek. Samir and Peggy.
Actually, Amy just touched on the question that I was looking for is once, because I read it within the regulation says about after 6 months, if they wanted to be a registered practice as a registered optician, what's the process behind it? So I was actually going to ask the same question as Derek.
Okay, thanks, Samir. Peggy.
What are the details of how it works when the emergency is over? So we work on a January to January basis. If the emergency ends June 15th, do they immediately become unregistered, and then they can use their experience to become registered in the normal manner, or decide to not?
So what will happen, Peggy, is that they won't automatically be no longer entitled to practice. Their emergency certificate will be valid until December 31st. Now, if the emergency doesn't exist anymore, they won't be eligible to renew as an emergency optician, but they will be eligible. They'll have a 6-month window after their certificate expires to apply for an RO certificate. They don't have to wait the 6 months. They can do it right away. If they have actually practiced as an emergency optician for any period of time, they'll be eligible for a certificate as an RO.
Because that goes into the criteria for normal registration qualification?
Yeah, so essentially that will be because ordinarily they would always be eligible to apply to reinstate their RO certificate, but because they had been out of practice, they might need to demonstrate other currency requirements. This will be the proxy for that currency requirement. They'll be able to say, I practiced as an emergency optician, so I don't need to do more refreshers or bridging or something to that effect. So they'll be eligible to have an expedited path essentially back to RO status.
So, and then from June to December, they can still be practicing as emergency opticians, even though the emergency is over,
Correct.
and the government's okay with that?
That's
In-
why they put in the criteria that the certificates can't be valid for more than a year. That's to account for the fact that we can't pull the rug out from under people in that manner. So this is balancing once again the, you know, the not ideal situation with managing a process like this.
Okay, so
for
that's
both the
why-
college
that's
and the
why-
individuals. Yeah,
That's why the government said 1 year.
exactly.
Max.
Yeah.
So, okay, cool. Thank you.
Anyone else have any other questions, concerns? I think it's important to note that both what Amy and Rob have said right at the start of their report is that this is a provincial government mandated program. So what little say that we have to put input into it. Otherwise, if we didn't, the government would just mandate it and say, here's the way it is, you're gonna abide by these regulations. So at least we're getting our foot in the door to say something. And otherwise, this probably topic wouldn't even be discussed if it wasn't until the government's on a whole bunch of other things of bringing in stuff to the province, and it's another mandatory form that they're saying, okay, we're bringing in this in. You can have your input. And if I can just share, at least we're getting some input into this, where as Fazelle and Amy and Derek and I found out last week, in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, when it came to changes, they didn't even get any say. They were just ram-jammed through in one day, the legislation in those provinces. So at least we're have some input into it. Not a lot, but at least a little bit. And that's to her credit and to the skill that Amy and Fazelle have in the contacts with the Ministry of Health, that we're able to provide this input. So I just want to say thank you, staff, for and everyone for providing input into this. It is a very important topic. So just moving on then, in regards to what Amy had mentioned earlier, is there any other public interest that can be identified with this that anyone might think of? Or is it all covered in the report, do you think? Okay, not hearing any. And with regards to the DEI considerations, are there any other points of considerations from a DEI standpoint the board would like to identify with respect to this decision that we'd be making today? Everyone seemed happy with that. Okay, and I'd like to test for a agreement using high five if needed, that if we have a consensus on this. Okay, anyone total disagreement at all? Anyone have any concerns? I'm not seeing any, so please speak out. Diana, you're on the phone. Are you okay with this proposal?
I'm in favor.
Thank you, Diana.
I'm in favor.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure your voice was heard. All right, then I would, having heard that, I'd like to move to a motion, and the motion that we're seeking is to approve the proposed amendments to the registration regulations as set out in Appendix A to be submitted to the Ministry of Health for approval and implementation. Do I have a mover?
So moved, Henry.
Henry, second.
Kevin.
Samir? All in favor? Anyone against? Not seeing any. The motion carries. Now we'd like to move on to the committee compensation. And first off, I'd like to welcome our new member, Alicia Munyon. She's from Oakville, Ontario. She is an MBA in strategic management from Taft University. She's a graduate certificate in strategic management from Harvard. She's currently the senior IT program manager for Samuel Son and Company, where she is responsible for cross-divisional programs, both for IT and the business, and managing IT integration for all mergers and ensuring alignment of legal, government, and compliance requirements. That's pretty good stuff. Alicia, would you like to have any further comment?
No, thank you everyone for the warm welcome. You've been so kind and I appreciate your support.
Thank you. Okay, so therefore I'd like to propose that Ms. Munyon be appointed to the Discipline Committee and the Steering Committee at this time, and that if necessary, the Executive Committee will bring its recommendations to the board for further appointments in June if necessary. Do I have a consensus on this topic?
I think you meant screening committee, Steve.
Screening Committee.
Yeah.
Yes, sorry, Screening Committee.
Okay.
If I could just provide just one word of context there, Steve, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The terms of reference of the screening committee state that it's made up of our non-board, non-optician members, so our appointed members who are not opticians. But it also gives the board discretion to appoint government-appointed public members to this committee to make sure that it has enough people to carry out its functions. We have 4 people on the committee right now who are non-board members and non-opticians. But in order to make sure there's enough people to make up panels to do the screening interviews for elections in September, and again for appointed member recruitment in November, it would be beneficial to have another individual. So Alicia, given that she's new to the board, she won't have any conflicts of interest as of yet.
No bias.
Through this process. So that is where this recommendation is stemming from. And in addition, as hopefully you're aware, we typically request that all board members and all appointed members be appointed as members of the Discipline Committee so that you could all be called upon in the event that a hearing is needed.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. So the motion that we're seeking is to appoint Alicia Munyon to the Discipline Committee and the Screening Committee. Do I have a mover?
Netta?
Netta, second?
Omar.
Omar, all in favor? Anyone
I'm in
against?
favor.
Thank you, Diane. The motion carries. So that concludes our meeting today, and we will move on to an adjournment then. So we'll need a motion to close the meeting. Motion? I'll motion it. And do I have a seconder?
Also second.
Okay, all in favor? Meeting carries, concludes. Thank you, everyone, for on YouTube watching it today and being with us. And I want to thank each and every board member for attending this morning. And thank you, staff, and Rob, for your work on this topic. Excellent job. Thank you.
Timelines?
Timeline, we're going to